doing full-on Michael Jackson moves, tried it again and again, over and over. And the moonwalk is very challenging.
The audition never happened. There was no casting call, no chemistry read, no callback, no formal screen test in a room full of people holding clipboards and forming quiet opinions. The most anticipated biopic in Hollywood history, a film carrying the weight of the most documented entertainment legacy ever assembled, found its lead actor through a 30-second voice note sent from a phone by someone who had never once considered becoming an actor and said so out loud when given the direct opportunity to lie about it. That fact alone should stop you, because it contains something that the entire entertainment industry operates on the assumption cannot be true, that the most important factor in casting the role of a generation wasn't training, wasn't credits, wasn't representation or industry relationships or a carefully constructed audition that demonstrated technical range. It was something transmitted through blood and proximity and a childhood spent watching someone move through the world in a way that left permanent impressions on everyone in the vicinity. But here is the part of the story that nobody has properly told yet, the part that gets buried under the headlines about bleeding feet and legal battles and a production that nearly collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. Jaafar Jackson didn't just inherit his uncle's voice and physical architecture. He inherited his uncle's specific relationship with suffering, the belief embedded so deeply in Michael Jackson's artistic DNA that it functioned less like a philosophy and more like a biological directive, that excellence is not a destination you arrive at through comfort, and that the only real measure of how much something matters to you is how much of yourself you are willing to destroy in pursuit of it. What Jaafar destroyed, and what he rebuilt from the wreckage, is the story that the finished film can only partially tell. Graham King had been developing the Michael Jackson biopic for years before the casting search reached its breaking point, and the breaking point arrived not dramatically but gradually, through the accumulation of nearly 200 disappointments spread across close to 2 years of exhaustive global searching. The scale of the search reflected the scale of the problem. Michael Jackson was not a cultural figure who existed at a comfortable historical distance, softened by time into an archetype that a skilled actor could approach through research and craft alone. He was someone whose every public gesture had been captured on film with extraordinary fidelity, whose vocal inflections had been analyzed by millions of people who could identify the specific emotional register of a particular live performance from a particular year of his career, whose physical movement had been studied and catalogued and debated with the kind of forensic intensity that most historical figures never receive while alive and few receive even after death. The person stepping into this role would be measured not against a general cultural impression, but against an evidence library so comprehensive that the margin for acceptable error was essentially zero. Professional impersonators arrived first, people who had devoted careers to exactly this kind of precision, and the cameras found them immediately and mercilessly, technically accurate in isolated moments, emotionally hollow in the sustained way that a 2-hour film requires. Trained actors with genuine emotional range couldn't locate the physical language. Dancers who had absorbed Michael's movement vocabulary couldn't access the interior emotional world that gave those movements their specific gravity. King described the accumulating despair of that period with unusual directness for someone in his position. They were searching for something that was beginning to feel like it might not exist. The casting office held an empty throne, and the longer it stayed empty, the more the production began to quietly fear that it might stay that way permanently. The voice note that ended the search arrived without announcement and without the formal apparatus of professional auditioning, which is perhaps why it worked in a way that 2 years of structured searching had not. Jaafar Jackson sent Graham King a simple audio recording in which he spoke quietly, inhabiting without apparent effort or strategic calculation the specific vocal frequency that people who had spent time with Michael Jackson off-camera, in the unguarded private moments between performances, would recognize with an immediacy that bypassed intellectual analysis entirely. King had encountered footage of Jaafar performing previously and had made a deliberate professional decision not to pursue him, understanding that casting the nephew of the man being depicted opened the production to an entire category of criticism about authenticity and nepotism that a project of this sensitivity could not comfortably absorb. The voice note made every one of those calculations beside the point. He played it once. He called back immediately. What he heard wasn't imitation, wasn't studied reproduction, wasn't the result of someone who had spent years practicing a specific vocal register until they could reproduce it on demand. What he heard was genetic transmission, the acoustic fingerprint of one generation carrying the specific emotional architecture of the previous one in a way that no studio technology and no amount of vocal coaching could have manufactured or installed. Music supervisor John Warhurst, working on the film's extraordinarily complex sound design, would later describe Jaafar's physical vocal structure as eerily similar to his uncle's, a similarity so precise that the film's intimate a cappella scenes used Jaafar's voice alone, without any blending with archival recordings, because no blending was necessary. But King didn't know any of that when he made the callback. He only knew that something in that voice note had done what 2 years of searching had failed to do. It made him certain. The certainty didn't survive contact with Jaafar's actual resume without requiring significant reconstruction. When King asked directly about acting experience, the answer arrived without hesitation or diplomatic softening. Never, and he had never wanted to be one. The entire acting history was a brief reality television appearance. He was being asked, from a standing start with no formal training and no professional foundation, to anchor the most scrutinized biopic in Hollywood history in a role that required him to sing, dance, act, and physically embody a man whose every public movement had been catalogued by millions of devoted analysts who would catch every error. The learning curve was not steep. It was essentially vertical, and it was slick. King assigned serious acting coaches who approached the task not by building technique onto an existing foundation but by doing something more fundamental and more uncomfortable, stripping Jaafar down to emotional nerve endings and rebuilding him from raw material upward, scene by scene, searching always for the vulnerability beneath the dialogue rather than the performance sitting on top of it. What the coaches found was surprising. His emotional instincts were unusually developed, shaped by a childhood spent in proximity to someone who communicated more through gesture and emotional frequency than through conventional verbal expression. He had absorbed, without knowing he was absorbing it, a sophisticated emotional vocabulary that formal training would have taken years to install. What he lacked was technical infrastructure, and he built it with a focus and a speed that surprised the people responsible for delivering it. He treated his complete inexperience not as a deficit requiring compensation but as a specific kind of freedom, the freedom of someone who has no established habits to defend and no previous version of themselves on screen to contradict. He had nothing to lose. He used that fact like a weapon. Antoine Fuqua's central directive to Jaafar from the earliest days of preparation was simple in its statement and enormously complex in its execution. There would be no imitation on his set. Not a tribute act, not an impersonation, not a technically accurate reproduction of surface behaviors performed with skill and commitment. The instruction was to find the man from the inside outward, to locate the emotional intention underneath every gesture before attempting to reproduce the gesture, to understand what each physical choice was communicating before deciding how to communicate it. Jaafar received this instruction as though it confirmed something he had already understood intuitively, because the alternative, performing a man he had known personally as a child, reproducing the gestures of someone whose private human presence he carried in actual memory rather than archival footage, would have felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything the preparation was supposed to achieve. He began approaching every piece of documented Michael Jackson performance not as choreography to be learned but as language to be translated, asking consistently and obsessively not what Michael was doing in a given moment but why. What specific wound or specific joy or specific variety of loneliness had produced this particular physical response at this particular instant? The moonwalk, he has said, is one thing to learn mechanically. Making it believable, making it feel like it emerges from a genuine interior state rather than a technical sequence, is an entirely different discipline that has nothing to do with footwork. He spent months on gestures that last seconds on screen, not because he was inefficient, but because he understood that the camera would find and amplify any moment where the exterior and the interior came apart, and he refused to give it that opportunity. The physical cost of inhabiting Michael Jackson's performance vocabulary across 3 years of sustained preparation is the dimension of this story that has received the most attention, and the attention is warranted because the numbers are genuinely extreme. Jaafar danced until his feet bled, routinely, not as an exceptional occurrence that punctuated otherwise manageable training, but as a standard feature of a schedule that made no accommodation for the human body's preference for gradual progression. Michael's iconic performance loafers, those smooth-soled instruments specifically engineered for gliding across a stage with the frictionless ease that audiences experienced as magic and physics experienced as an engineering problem, were constructed with no rubber tread and no grip, offering no forgiveness for a pivot that landed even marginally wrong. Every misplaced weight shift punished him with fresh blisters stacked on bruises that hadn't finished forming. Muscles locked during nights that felt more like physical interrogations than rest. But the dimension of the physical cost that deserves significantly more attention than it typically receives is its duration. Production delays caused by the industry strikes of 2023, combined with legally necessitated reshoots that stretched across 22 additional days and cost somewhere between $10 and $50 million, extended the period during which Jaafar was required to maintain Michael's famously lean physical conditioning far beyond any original projection. More than 2 full years of peak physical maintenance. Every meal calculated. Every calorie measured against the demands of a role requiring concert-level performance energy sustained across 20 to 30 takes in a single shooting day, beginning before dawn, maintained through the afternoon, repeated the following morning. A production insider described the physical discipline as something that aged him visibly while simultaneously armoring him in ways that no ordinary preparation process produces. By the time cameras rolled on the final reshoots, the physical resemblance had become so complete that crew members who had worked alongside him for months would still occasionally find themselves staring a moment too long, the recognition arriving in the body before the mind could contextualize it. The psychological architecture of the preparation is where the story becomes genuinely singular, where the territory being navigated stops resembling any conventional account of an actor preparing for a demanding role and starts resembling something that doesn't have a clean professional category. Moving back into Havenhurst, the sprawling Jackson family compound where Thriller was conceived and where the entire trajectory of global popular music shifted in the early 1980s, was described publicly as an immersive research decision. In practice, it became something more consuming and more psychologically complex than that framing suggests. Jaafar slept in different bedrooms sequentially across the weeks and months, describing the motivation as a need to feel the energy that the room still contained, the atmospheric residue of a life lived with extraordinary intensity within those particular walls. He placed a thin Japanese mattress directly on the floor and declined a conventional bed, an ascetic choice that seemed to emerge from an intuitive understanding that ordinary comfort was incompatible with the specific kind of dissolution he was pursuing. The dance studio Michael had used became simultaneously the place where he suffered most and the place where he felt most aligned with what he was attempting to locate. A spare room he converted into a research environment became the project's most psychologically revealing artifact. Fuqua, visiting it, compared it directly and without hyperbole to the obsessive evidence board from A Beautiful Mind. When the Jackson estate granted him access to Michael's private journals, the handwritten private record of fears and daily mantras and uncensored emotional responses that Michael had never written for any audience, Jaafar described the experience as a genuine breaking point, the moment when the preparation crossed from intensive research into something that felt more like psychological occupation. He began covering every remaining surface of the room with his own handwritten affirmations, responding to Michael's private language with his own, until no paint was visible anywhere and the boundary between his psychology and his uncle's had become functionally impossible to locate. He stayed inside that dissolution long enough that the distinction between his own thoughts and the thoughts he was absorbing required conscious effort to maintain, and there were stretches of the preparation during which that effort was not always made. The people closest to Jaafar experienced his transformation through lenses that were personal and complicated and sometimes contradictory in ways that simple narratives about family support cannot fully contain. His mother knew nothing for 12 consecutive months, a secret maintained across a full year of daily preparation that consumed every available resource he possessed. The reasoning was emotionally precise. The moment she knew, the weight of what he was attempting would become her weight also, and a mother's specific protective anxiety about her child walking into the most scrutinized role in Hollywood history would introduce a frequency into preparation that was already operating at its absolute limit. He needed to locate Michael in his own reflection before the people who loved him most had the opportunity to react to what they saw there. When she finally came to the set and watched her son's posture reshape into Michael's characteristic inward tilt and heard that whisper-soft voice emerge from a body she had known since his birth, she experienced something she had not prepared for and could not immediately name. Jermaine Jackson, who had shared not just bloodline with Michael but a childhood bedroom and a stage and decades of unspoken brotherhood, had still not seen the finished film as of the most recent reporting. That absence functioned as the loudest review imaginable, the judgment that exists only in anticipation and cannot be managed or softened through any available means. Katherine Jackson, the woman who raised Michael in a small Gary, Indiana home and knew every private dimension of who he actually was beneath the mythology, visited the set without significant announcement, watched Jaafar in the unguarded moments between takes rather than during formal performance, and responded with 4 words spoken barely above a whisper to the person standing nearest to her: "It's like seeing a ghost." Those 4 words, involuntary and unperformed, delivered in genuine reaction to what she was witnessing, silenced every doubt that had been circulating through the production since principal photography began. No tracking number or critical consensus could have delivered what those 4 words delivered to someone who had spent 3 years working toward exactly this recognition from exactly this person. There is a legal absence living at the center of the finished film that shapes everything around it and deserves to be understood clearly rather than treated as a production footnote. Fuqua had originally shot material engaging directly with the 1993 child abuse allegations, approaching that contested and painful period in Michael's history with the seriousness and complexity that both the subject and the audience deserved. During editing, The Jackson estate identified a clause in the decades-old Chandler settlement agreement explicitly prohibiting any depiction of Chandler or his family in future productions. The footage was legally unusable regardless of its artistic merit. Reshoots consumed 22 additional days of production and costs that insiders placed somewhere between $10 and $50 million. The film's third act was restructured to conclude in the late 1980s, before the allegations became public, and Fuqua described the necessity of that restructuring with a specific vocabulary of someone absorbing a loss they cannot fully express, a punch in the gut, a heavy story he could no longer tell. The finished film is therefore shaped as much by legal silence as by creative intent, defined by what could not be depicted as much as by what needed to be expressed. Jaafar's performance exists inside that constraint and fills the silence it creates with something that no settlement agreement can legislate away: the genuine emotional intelligence of a nephew who spent 3 years trying to understand his uncle not as a legend or a legal entity or a contested cultural symbol, but as a human being whose complexity and suffering and extraordinary capacity for joy all deserve more than the mythology that has accumulated around them. The moment that everyone present on set describes with a specific reverence that people reserve for experiences exceeding their capacity for real-time processing arrived during an unbroken take of Man in the Mirror. Jaafar finished the performance completely drenched, trembling, holding the final emotional weight of the song somewhere interior rather than releasing it immediately into the air around him. He opened his eyes. The soundstage was completely frozen. Camera operators with decades of professional experience were crying without self-consciousness. Extras had stopped performing and were standing motionless, arrested by something that had exceeded the boundaries of their role in the production. Fuqua forgot to call cut, and the silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the specific presence of something that a room full of people creates when they have collectively witnessed something they will spend the remainder of their professional lives measuring other experiences against. When the final scene wrapped, Jaafar walked alone to his trailer, removed the loafers that had cost him more skin than he had originally understood he possessed, and sat completely still in the quiet. The sentence he used to describe that moment contains the entire story in compressed form. I had to learn how to be Jaafar again. 3 years of deliberate psychological dissolution, of systematically erasing the border between himself and his uncle until it became unlocatable, had left him with a specific disorientation that has no clean name in any professional vocabulary. He is building himself back now, writing music that carries his own voice without blending, constructing an identity in public that belongs to him rather than to the legacy he was entrusted to carry. He will always carry Michael, he says, with a calm that has been paid for rather than assumed. But he cannot live inside him permanently. The world watched Jaafar become his uncle. What it hasn't yet understood is who emerges next, on his own terms, carrying everything those 3 years permanently changed about him, ready to introduce himself without a ghost standing alongside him, and more than capable of filling the silence on his own.